Parece que hay un eco para que nos escuchen mejor. ¿Ah? Eh, y la Oficina Regional de Educación para América Latina y el Caribe, Orial UNESCO, tiene el agrado de saludarlos. En este lanzamiento regional del programa para la evaluación internacional de alumnos, PISA, de la OCDE de 2022. PISA mide la capacidad de los estudiantes de 15 años para utilizar sus conocimientos,
their knowledge and skills in reading, mathematics, and science to meet real-life challenges. The most recent measurement was conducted in 2022, and 14 countries from this region took part in that measurement. And the goal of this event is to disseminate these results and promote their use to better address the challenges that the countries in the region face with regard to learning outcomes and to promote actions for an educational transformation that will enable us to move towards inclusive and quality education. For the opening session, we are joined by ECLAC authorities from the OECD and from UNESCO. And in this regard, I would like to greet the Executive Secretary of ECLAC, José Manuel Salazar Sirinach. We will also be joined virtually by Andreas Schleicher, the Director of Education and Skills from the OECD. And also, we are joined here today by Claudia Uribe, Director of the Multisectoral Regional Office of UNESCO in Santiago. I would therefore like to invite José Manuel Salazar Sirinach to make his welcoming remarks. Go ahead, Executive Secretary. Thank you, Alberto, and good morning to all. Good morning to those physically present here today, as well as those joining us virtually. Welcome to this regional launch of the results of the PISA 2022 test conducted by the OECD. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I would like to specifically thank Andreas Schleicher, the Director of Education and Skills of the OECD, who is joining us online to share in the launching of these outcomes. The results specifically with regard to the 14 countries that took part in this most recent measurement, the 14 countries from the LAC region. I am very pleased to state that we have forged a strong partnership with the UNESCO meeting for the ministers of education from this region. This will be held on January 25, 26 here at ECLAC. Just a few weeks ago, and the Caribbean 2023. In said outlook, we said that after 3 years of prolonged social crisis triggered by COVID-19 and other external shocks, the region has begun to show some signs of recovery in several areas regarding social aspects such as employment, poverty, etc. But this recovery has been quite slow. And when compared to pre-pandemic levels, the region continues to be caught in this quagmire of the dual trap of high levels of poverty and inequality. Now, unfortunately, one of the dimensions where we clearly have not bounced back is education. In fact, the educational blackout in Latin America and the Caribbean was worse in our region than any other region around the globe and has left us scarred. And some of these scars will be made quite evident today during this presentation. They will be visible as well in this region for many years to come. Now, given the importance of this topic, we in the social outlook refer to the impact of the pandemic on the education system. Now, these educational impacts are quite alarming because the damage to human talent is something that has an impact on many aspects of social well-being, and they also have an negative impact on social mobility, on growth, ability for the middle class. They have an impact on poverty and other areas, and they also have a negative impact on democracies. Because given the educational deterioration, we see that the hope of having a better life is also somewhat deteriorated for many young people, and this leads to despair. Therefore, in order to make progress towards a more sustainable, inclusive, and democratic and pattern that is more based on social justice, making progress with regard to educational aspects is critical. Educational deterioration is not a very good sign if we aim to have a better future in all of the aspects related to sustainable development. Now, all the successful sustainable development strategies call for investing in education. This is not just about resources, but about results as well. Having higher resources, investing more in resources does not necessarily lead to better outcomes. And that brings us to a very complex can of worms to discuss. Now, the educational blackout took place for quite a while in our region, and it had very disparaging outcomes. And this is something we need to address urgently. We have not seen much progress since the end of the educational blackout. So we also last year published information on progress on SDG 4, and we said that despite the educational progress in the region over the last decade, just prior to the pandemic, we had already seen a bit of stagnancy in terms of that progress. Now, these regional outcomes revealed in-depth crises throughout the region, and there was this thought that this would be worsened as a result of the interruption of face-to-face education. Now, the outcomes of the 2022 PISA program has actually confirmed our worst fears with regard to this overall deterioration in the learnings of an entire generation of school students, not just in our region, but around the globe. The study also provides relevant information on what has happened to some educational systems during the crisis. So today, our invitation is to understand how serious these trends and outcomes are. And then we will discuss how we can best leverage this information to teach others and to take concrete actions for the betterment of our education systems in the countries, something that is so urgently needed. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, secretario ejecutivo, por sus palabras de apertura. Y ahora vamos a colocar, digamos, un video que nos ha enviado el director de Educación y Habilidades de la ODGE, Andreas Schleider.
Colleagues and friends, after 4 challenging years, today our flagship program for international student assessment of PISA gives us an update on this state of education globally, helping us to see how our students are prepared for tomorrow.
No estamos viendo el video.
From all sorts of backgrounds, getting a chance to succeed, and whether our education systems
Tenemos interpretación, aprovecho de dar ese dato, interpretación inglés-español y por cierto a quienes nos están...
There's interpretation, English and Spanish, and we have 250 people by Zoom, and they have interpretation if they so wish.
Colleagues and friends, after 4 challenging years, today our flagship program for international student assessment of PISA gives us an update of the state of education globally, helping us to see how well students are prepared for tomorrow as well, to what extent students from all social backgrounds get a fair chance to succeed, and whether our education systems provide good value for money. These last years have been really tough for young people. The pandemic has disrupted their lives and their education. Economic uncertainty has affected their families. Now, social media and artificial intelligence have created new opportunities, but also new challenges for young people. Many of today's young people will enter jobs that do not resemble the jobs of today. Everywhere you see the green transition, demographic change, and digital technologies fundamentally transforming the world of work. education is the path to this future. Our schools today, our economy, and our democracy tomorrow. And education is not just a conduit of acquiring knowledge, it is the very foundation upon which we build human flourishing, tolerance, social cohesion. Education unlocks potential, builds bridges, and empowers communities. So it's important for us to take stock of where education stands, but even more so to understand where students, schools, and nations succeeded in those difficult years of the pandemic, and where we can learn from that to help students learn better, to help teachers teach better, and school systems to become more effective. And that's exactly what PISA is about. From Argentina to Denmark, from Ukraine to the Palestinian Authority, PISA provides the most reliable global metric on what students know and what they can do in subjects that matter for their success. All in all, nearly 700,000 students from 81 countries and economies took the latest PISA test in 22. And that makes it the largest international comparison of education progress ever. The 22 assessment put the main emphasis on mathematics, and this wasn't just about formulas and equations, but we looked at whether students can reason mathematically and solve problems in real-world context. This ability has become so fundamental for making well-founded judgments and for navigating the complexities of our rapidly changing world. If you don't understand the concept of an exponential function, you're going to have a hard time understanding the dynamics of climate change or the evolution of a pandemic. So what do we see? Well, for a start, many countries made significant progress towards the goal of universal secondary education, and that's crucial to enabling everyone to participate fully in the 21st century world. In the Americas, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica provide impressive examples of getting more people into education. Despite the pandemic, countries in Latin America often show remarkable stability in learning outcomes, but actually at a rather low overall level. And that raises the question whether school before the pandemic offered young people the kind of learning opportunities which they need. So what can be done? Well, there's no perfect recipe for success in education. The PISA 22 results, however, provide us with some important insights. For a start, PISA challenges the notion that, more investment in education automatically yields better outcomes. Yes, there is a positive relationship between investment in education and average performance, up to a threshold of about, $75,000 US in spending per student up to the age of 15. And that's, most countries in Latin America are lie below that level. But after that level, extra spending makes actually little difference. And many countries in the OECD areas today find themselves beyond that point of no return. What actually matters at least as much and sometimes more is how the resources are used. Now, countries committed to establishing top-tier education systems tend to prioritize the quality of teaching over the size of their classes. They also provide funding mechanisms that align resources with needs, with special attention to the students who need it most. They invest wisely in school infrastructure, including digital resources. PISA also shows that students have generally embraced learning through digital technologies. On average, across OECD countries, about 3 out of 4 students reported that they were confident using various technologies, including learning management systems, school learning platforms, video communication programs, and so on. And the same proportion also reported they rarely had technical problems learning remotely during school shutdowns in the pandemic. More importantly, even after accounting for social backgrounds, students who spend up to 1 hour per day learning on digital devices in their school scored 14 points higher in mathematics than students who spend no time. So the integration of technology in learning can be a very powerful lever. At the same time, technology used for leisure rather than instruction, such as using mobile phones, is clearly linked to poorer results. Students who said they become distracted by other students who are using digital devices scored 15 points lower than students who reported that this almost never happens, even after accounting for social background. So how can education grapple with technological change? It's going to be a defining feature of the new educational landscape. But it's also clear that technology cannot be a substitute for the attention and the care of a teacher, or for the social experience of being among peers that the physical environment of schools provides. PISA data show that this is particularly true in times of disruption. The availability of teachers to help students in need had the strongest relationship to mathematics performance in Latin America, compared to other experiences linked to COVID-19 school closures. Mathematics scores were 15 score points higher on average in places where students said they had good access to teacher help. And these students were also more confident than their peers to learn autonomously and remotely. And despite that, only 7 in 10 students overall reported that they regularly received extra help from teachers in 22. And related to this, 35% of students said that teachers did not regularly show an interest in every student's learning, on average across OECD countries, and failed to ensure that all students understood the content. We need to do better on that. PISA also sheds light on the crucial role of families. Students who were supported at home had more positive attitudes towards school and towards learning. Overall, education systems with positive trends in parental engagement in student learning between 2018 and 22 also showed greater stability or even improvement in their mathematics performance on the PISA test. And that was particularly true for disadvantaged students. Over the last decades, we have seen a negative trend towards commodifying education. Students became passive consumers of prefabricated content. Teachers became some kind of service providers, and parents became clients. And that has taken out the heart of a good education, which is always about creating a whole of society experience. We need to reverse that trend. We need to reimagine education, to make our students leaders for a better future, to help our teachers become great coaches and mentors and creative designers of innovative learning environments, and to build communities that do not conserve but truly transform education. And that's not about making the impossible possible, but about making the possible attainable. Colleagues and friends, after 4 challenging years, today our flagship program for international students has.
Estupendo. Perfecto, vamos a agradecer, digamos, a la OCDE y al director de Educación y Habilidades, Andreas Schleicher, por este saludo y de bienvenida para este lanzamiento PISA 2022 en sus resultados para América Latina y el Caribe. Y tengo entonces el gusto ahora darle la palabra a Claudia Uribe, directora, Oficina Regional Multisectorial de la UNESCO en Santiago. Muchas gracias, Claudia, por estar esta mañana con nosotros.
Thank you, Alberto, and good morning for all those that are accompanying us in the presential way, and all those that are accompanying us by Zoom through the different platforms. I would like to greet in the first place the colleagues with whom I have the pleasure of sharing this opening session, Jose Manuel Salazar, Executive Secretary of ECLAC, and thank you, Jose Manuel, for being the host of this important meeting. Greetings to Andrea Schleicher, Director of Education and Skills of the OECD, and also, of course, my dear Alberto Arenas, Director of the Division Social Development of ECLAC. Greetings to all our guests, friends that have wished to be present today and speak about such an important subject as the one that convenes us here and that we hope for every 3 years, in the moment when the results of the PISA examination are seen, and that has become a milestone not only of our region but of the whole world. It is for me a great pleasure to share with you certain ideas in regards to the PISA test, understanding that the speakers that accompany us today will make an analysis of the results. I want to use these minutes of intervention to comment some of the messages of UNESCO. We would like to point out because they question our region of Latin America and the Caribbean. As you well know, PISA is applied to students of 15 years old in the areas of reading, mathematics, and science, allowing us to know their levels of development of the basic competitions for life, work, and full integration to society. As said a moment ago by Andrea Schleicher, it is a window in a series of dimensions that are very important and that are linked also with what is said by Jose Manuel a minute ago, for the development of the region in matters of prosperity, economics. How well are we prepared for this? Thus, the PISA results offer us an information that is valuable for the monitoring of the quality and equity of educational systems. Aside from the development of the students, PISA also offers us rich information that sometimes is not observed in some of our conversations. It offers us tools to understand aspects such as the social, emotional situation of students, school activities and extra school activities, the use of technology and of digital applications, and the conditions of work of the teachers, amongst other aspects that are outstanding and that give us an idea that is quite complete of the status of education in the world. The publication of these results in the first place constitutes a clear call to not lose our focus on the importance of educational work, and it gives us the opportunity to analyze important subjects as having a glance that is regional and Latin American. PISA 2022 transmits a message of urgency. The results of the evaluation confirmed trends that were manifested beforehand in the region and that we had pointed out from our studies of LRC, and it also gives us data that challenge the frameworks of interpretation, where truly we invite not to have a complacent analysis or one that is too easy. Amongst the first results, clearly, the region of Latin America and the Caribbean is at the end of the distribution of scores, with specific results that are low in the area of mathematics.
Señalan a los países de la OCDE, estas diferencias en rendimiento equivalen más o menos a 5 años de escolaridad. Eso quiere decir, en términos prácticos, que nuestros alumnos de 6º grado podrían estar demostrando unos resultados equivalentes a niños de 1º de primaria en promedio. Obviamente hay diferencias en la región. Los resultados también nos revelan que en el conjunto de 14 países participantes de América Latina hay un elevado porcentaje de estudiantes que no logra desarrollar competencias elementales ni en matemáticas, lectoescritura, que son aquellas competencias que posibilitan seguir aprendiendo. En promedio, entre los países de América Latina que participaron en la prueba PISA, solo un 25% de los estudiantes alcanzaron las competencias mínimas en matemáticas, para participar con habilidades necesarias para participar plenamente en la sociedad. Sin embargo, vemos una gran variación en los resultados de los países. En países, por ejemplo, como Chile y Uruguay, los estudiantes que alcanzaron competencias mínimas alcanzan un 44%, mientras que hay otros países de la región que no vale la pena señalar, en donde solamente 1 de cada 10 pudieron alcanzar estos niveles mínimos. Quiere decir que más del 90% de los estudiantes en algunos países de la región no están alcanzando niveles mínimos esperados. Para el caso de lectura, solo la mitad de los estudiantes en la región lograron mostrar estas competencias básicas, donde nuevamente vemos los extremos del rango con Chile, en donde se ve que el 66% de los estudiantes logran alcanzar este nivel, mientras que hay otros países en donde menos del 25%.
Whereas less than 25% reach it. Taking into account that these scores, as analyzed by OECD, 20 points of difference are equivalent to 1 year of schooling. So these scores show also the differences in that regard, that there is between countries, but also inside the countries. At the same time, the PISA data confirm what in other evaluations at great scale has been revealed, and Jose Manuel mentioned this some moments ago, and that is that learning in the region have been stagnant. Our last test, the LERCE, showed stagnation since 2013, where indicators have not moved. And evidently today, well, with the pandemic, we see that we are going backwards. There's also a lot of inequity associated to the results. And in those countries where the inequity between the quartiles has decreased, this is not because there's been a general improvement, but the closure of the gaps has taken place thanks to the fact that the students in the upper quintiles have decreased their performance. Regarding the gaps between gender, the diagnoses are mixed, but we see in countries like Colombia, like Brazil, and then Chile, that the distance between the performance of girls and boys has grown, but girls have done worse, and this worries us particularly. And there we could have the hypothesis of the behaviors we saw during the pandemic, where girls in general terms were more restricted in their educational possibilities due to the burden of homework. Only in the case of Peru and Dominican Republic, the performance of women improved as compared with previous evaluations. On the other hand, it is a paradox to recognize that the Latin American region that has had one of the longest interruptions of in-person classes show a setback in the results of OECD between 2018 and 2022. And this has been analyzed in depth. And here, really, it would be important to carry out an analysis of the situation, a very careful analysis that would allow to enhance a research agenda, allowing us to understand that phenomenon without reaching conclusions too quickly. Even though we could have faced a worse scenario, PISA results shows us that we are in a position where we wouldn't like to be. An eloquent proof of that is that in the countries of the region, they are amongst those that have the lowest performance in amongst the 81 countries that participated in this analysis. We've been through a crisis worldwide, and maybe the true dimension of the impact of the pandemic in the education of children and adolescents remains as something that we still cannot understand fully. PISA 2022 for us as regional UNESCO office, well, we understand our position in the global context, but this allows us to think about the need for a regional perspective about this problem that is affecting all the countries. There are some key tasks like follow-up reports of SDG 4 headed by our office and the work carried out by our Latin American lab for the evaluation of the quality of education, SECHE. Regarding SDG 4 follow-up, Jose Manuel mentioned it. One of the key contributions has been the regional report on monitoring, which is the crossroads between Latin America and the Caribbean, that we published with ECLAC and UNICEF in September 2022, and that shows the educational trends since the global adoption of SDG 4, and the messages of which are along the same lines of what PISA 2022 shows today. It is vitally important also to see the work of the evaluation of JESE from the Latin American lab. They work together with Latin American country. Today we have some of the national coordinators, and I greet them. And these measure the achievement of schools in primary education. They generate relevant information on the attainment of learning goals, and this allows us to understand many aspects related with the quality of education in a comprehensive way. The JESE is also implementing a special post-pandemic evaluation, and they are preparing the next comparative and explanatory research work that will be implemented in 2025. The results of these studies will help us complement this vision offered by PISA 2022, and maybe that will give us greater insight to understand the results shown today by PISA 2022. So to conclude, I would like to congratulate the responsible for PISA 2022 and thank you, because the contribution of PISA, we consider it as an enormous contribution. We also take advantage of this opportunity that allows us to have a global perspective, and this allows Latin America and the Caribbean to position itself vis-a-vis other countries in the world without losing the focus on what's urgent for us, and also having a dialogue that will allow us to follow the situation of the countries and continue to work for the development through concrete agendas and actions that will really change the classroom and the educational experience in all our countries. With this, dear Alberto would like to conclude. Thank you very much. Thank you, Claudia Uribe, for these opening remarks and for being with us today in this launching, and also Mr. Andreas Schleicher from OECD, Mr. Jose Manuel Salazar Cirinach, Executive Secretary of ECLAC, for his participation in the opening ceremony. Greetings to everybody in person here and the 400 people that are following us on Zoom. And now, Mariana Wepe, official of social development, and she will continue. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you to everyone, to those who are here and those who are following us virtually. for the Latin American, the Caribbean regional launch PISA 2022. We have persons from the United States to the south of Chile and Argentina. We will continue with our meeting, and we will have now the main presentations. First, Daniela Truco, giving us a general perspective, social and educational for the region. And then we will continue with Daniel Salinas from the OECD, who will be presenting some of the main results of PISA 2022. Daniela, you have the floor. Thank you, Mariana. I will share a PowerPoint. I hope you will be able to see it. Well, good morning to everyone. I'm glad we have participants in person, and we take advantage of the learnings of the lessons of the pandemic, and we have so many people connected from around the region. Today, this presentation is connected to Daniel's presentation. This is a regional perspective of education. The main context, I will be speaking about the social context of the region, some indicators of the educational trends, and how we are doing in our progress towards SDG 4, and finally, the educational blackout during the COVID-19 pandemic. We begin with the social context of the region, and here you have the main indicators presented some weeks ago here in the launching of our yearly report, the social perspective of Latin America and the Caribbean, focused in labor inclusion this year, but I will be speaking about some of the main indicators at a social level. First, the region is facing a context of low growth, and this context has an impact on labor. There you can see the long-term trends, the creation of employment in 2014, 2023 has been one of the lowest since the 50s. The rate of growth of the number of persons occupied will be 1.26% compared with 3.2%, which was what we had in the lost decade of the 80s in the region. In 2020, during the pandemic, the creation of employment dropped by 8.2%, and that was the only drop in the last 70 years in the region. After an increase of poverty in the region during the pandemic, in 2022, we see that persons in situation of poverty at a regional level went back to pre-pandemic levels. Anyway, these figures are quite high. 29% of the population in 2022 was in a situation of poverty, and in extreme poverty, 11.4%, which is equivalent to 70 million persons. And given the economic rate of growth expected from 2023 of 1.7%, this does not allow us to foresee improvements this year.
We can also see what occurred in 2020. Income equality declined to levels below those reached prior to the pandemic. And during the pandemic, inequality had increased for the first time in many years. And then in 2022, we observed that in 9 of the 12 countries in Latin America that have information on the Gini inequality index, we saw that their outcomes were lower than the 2019 outcomes. The reduction in the Gini index was 1.1% per year on average for that period, and this reduction was at a higher rate than that observed between 2014 and 2019. This is good news, but still we have a significant challenge here with regard to inequality and income distribution. And we also have a relevant challenge with regard to the high concentration of wealth present throughout the region. For example, with these data, we can see that in 2021, the wealth of just 105 individuals accounted for almost 9% of the regional GDP. In that same year, we can see that the average wealth of the 1,000 billionaires in the region amounted to $4.3 billion. And the average wealth of the rest of the population amounted to only $18,000. So clearly, there is yet another significant challenge there with regard to inequality as a measurement of distribution of wealth, which is something we also see expressed throughout other areas, dimensions throughout the region. Let me now refer to the key educational trends and progress that we have seen with regard to attaining SDG 4. In this section, I will review some of the main outcomes of a report that we actually published last year. Claudia mentioned this report. We published it with UNESCO and UNICEF on the regional monitoring of Sustainable Development Goal 4, as well as other indicators assessed and reviewed under our Social Outlook 2022 for the LAC region, which delve deeper into educational issues, in fact. Now, first of all, allow me to mention that this report reviews the main indicators for which information is available, and it also reviews the progress made in recent decades prior to the pandemic. We can see great progress in the region, in fact, for example, with regard to the literacy rate, which is shown on the graph on the left, which is increasing significantly, reaching almost 95% of the population aged 15 and older, and with significant growth rates for people over 65 years of age. Moreover, on the right, we can see that the proportion of the population that reaches each educational level has increased, but we still have significant challenges in terms of secondary education in the region, where we see that only less than 50% of the population actually has a high level of secondary education. Now, we have said that completing secondary education is a minimum floor to facilitate the future trajectory of young people, increasing the probability of breaking the intergenerational transmission of poverty and securing higher levels of well-being. We know that this region is very unequal and that educational results are marked by different pillars of the matrix of social inequality in the region, among which we have the territory where the students live, the socioeconomic situation of their families, their gender, their race, ethnicity, their migratory status. We will also refer to that later. Danielle will refer to those aspects, migratory status, as I mentioned, disability, among others. Now, here we can see two dimensions, territory and household income. And here we can see how the region has made progress in reducing these gaps. But with regard to concluding higher levels of secondary education, we see significant gaps with regard to the first and fifth quintile of income. Moreover, this review has also revealed a slowdown in progress of some of the indicators. In primary education, for example, the net attendance rate is almost universal, and also in lower secondary, where the rates have over 90% have been achieved. Since 2015, the year in which the country's committed to the 2030 agenda, there has not been any major progress. In upper secondary, we see that progress continues to be made, but at lower rates. In other words, the countries are reaching this core group of individuals who are more difficult to include in the education system, and as such, the significant transformations of the system are required, and this needs to be coordinated with other sectors of public policies to break away with these more rigid cores of exclusion. Now, the same was observed with early childhood education, which is fundamental for reducing inequalities throughout educational trajectories. Now, despite the progress in enrollment rates at the pre-primary level and in early childhood programs, the changes there are lower than in the period prior to 2015. Finally, allow me to mention that both in Latin America and the Caribbean, and here I would like to refer to investments in education and our status in the region. But just again, both Latin America and the Caribbean meet one of the two agreed minimums for education financing. That is public investment in education of at least 4% of the GDP or 15% of total public spending. Now, despite this, there is a great deal of a disparity among the countries. Some countries meet both of these thresholds. Others meet the GDP threshold, but need to prioritize education more in public spending. And other countries, although they meet the prioritization criteria, they need to expand their fiscal capacity to reach the magnitude regarding GDP. And then again, you have other countries that do not meet either of the two thresholds and need to prioritize more and invest more. Now, the latter is the case of 6 of the 18 countries for which information is available for 2022 and that are shown on the graph. They are on the lower left-hand corner of this chart. Also, it's important to bear in mind that when analyzing magnitude of educational investment per student, the evidence is clear that all countries in the region suffer from a problem of underfunding in education. On average, OECD countries invest per student almost 5 times what Latin American Caribbean countries invest. And this difference is even more worrisome when one considers the major challenges that the region still faces in terms of coverage and learning.
Perdón.
Claudia already mentioned this, that before the pandemic, Latin America had already experienced key learning deficiencies. For example, this was measured by the UNESCO-led Laboratory for Evaluation of the Quality of Education. And we saw that in 2018, in 13 of the 16 countries, 50 to 94% of the lowest income students did not reach the minimum level of performance in mathematics in primary school. And differences in the lowest performance level between the lowest income students and the highest income students are very high in many countries, as you can see on the screen. In other words, in 2019, we saw that only 17% of sixth graders were achieving minimum levels in math and 31% in reading. In other words, this region was already undergoing a significant education crisis, as Claudia mentioned, and therefore our expectations regarding the PISA 2022 results were aligned with that. Now, let me refer to some of the challenges related to the educational blackout during the COVID-19 pandemic in our region. Now, Latin America and the Caribbean suffered the longest educational blackout in the world. The average interruption of face-to-face education lasted 70 weeks in the region, and this was the longest in the world, which was 41 weeks. On average, the countries in the region had 33 weeks of full closure, and this was longer in Latin America than it was in the Caribbean nations. And we know that school is a key outlet for children, not just for cognitive and academic development, but also for the comprehensive well-being of boys and girls. And the school is also a place to protect other childhood rights. We also saw that educational continuity in the region was limited by inequalities with regard to access to connectivity, equipment, and digital skills. In this chart, I'm showing you households with children under age 18. And here we see the households without internet connection. In 8 of the 12 countries in the region for which we had information, more than 60% of the poor population under 18 years of age does not have connectivity, does not have internet connection. And in 3 of those countries, the rate was more than 80%. Also, the type of devices to access the internet also had an impact on the educational continuity. Having a cell phone at home is not the same as having a computer or having several devices or having to share the devices with your siblings. Insufficient equipment led to what we call this digital overcrowding, even in what we call connected homes. Now, another barrier here was insufficient digital skills among the students, boys and girls, and among the educational communities as a whole, including parents, caretakers, teachers, all of whom had to convey their learnings online. The impact of children, adolescents, and young adults was not only educational. We have said several times that the impact has affected different aspects of their well-being. We saw higher risks of violence, higher rates of violence. We saw poverty grew, infant mortality rose as well. And of course, we hope that we also know that this has impacted, caused even greater gaps with regard to inequality, and this has an impact on mental health and other impacts. Now, with regard to what we can measure in terms of delay in the entry to early childhood education, we here can see that this population group was the most affected with regard to attending an educational establishment. And pre-primary care or attendance dropped significantly during the pandemic. And this is the only educational level we have not yet returned to pre-pandemic levels. And as we have seen, this blackout did not affect everyone the same. Certain groups and countries are, as a result, able to bounce back quicker when going back to face-to-face. Now, here we have primary and secondary school attendance rates that have returned to pre-pandemic levels. Perhaps this is associated with the automatic passing trends that took place during the pandemic. But perhaps as far as this indicator, what this indicator can measure in terms of attendance rates, it does not necessarily measure all of the impacts of remote education on teaching processes, the importance of attending school on a regular basis. We know that this has also been affected. Therefore, this does not necessarily refer to the intensity or the frequency of students' contact. And what we do know is that the levels of dropout rates and exclusion rates are high and unequal, particularly beginning in secondary education. And this graph shows the percentage of young people who should be in higher secondary schooling, but who do not attend. And of course, this is also affected by the different pillars of the inequality matrix. We can see that in the rural areas, this rate is higher than is in urban rates. And of course, the axes of inequality intersect and combine. We can see that in 1 in every 4 rural youth living in extreme poverty does not attend high school or secondary education. And the dropout rates of young people, the same age group who live in urban areas and belong to households in poverty or extreme poverty, are much lower and are similar to those who come from rural areas and who come from higher income households, roughly 15%, and so on and so forth with different components of the inequality matrix. It's important to make these excluded populations more visible. Let me close. Now, the regional situation shows that despite the progress in recent decades, our region has a major doubt with regard to inequality and education debt even prior to the pandemic. Now, after the pandemic, there are new educational needs that are just added to this long laundry list of requirements. For example, it's important to recover the socio-emotional well-being of educational communities. Many of the countries have been working on this already. It's important to re-engage students who dropped out, who are not attending school regularly. It's also important to evaluate and recover learning and rethink skills, the skills that need to be reinforced. Moreover, it's important to learn from educational innovations that emerge during this extremely abnormal period and to maximize digital leverage in education and to make sure that we use digital tools as a means to an end, which is education. And I'm sure some of the individuals here will refer to many of the learnings that we glean from the PISA out test and its outcomes. So thank you very much. And now I will give the floor to Danielle.
Buenos días.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the invitation and the interest in the PISA study. I will present a summary of the main results of PISA 2022, giving special attention to the 14 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean that participated in this study. A week ago, December 5th, 2 volumes were published with the results, the initial results of PISA 2022. These 2 volumes are the basis of my presentation for today. Volume 1 copes with the academic learning and the quality of education. For equity, we see differences in the efficiency of the students by gender and immigration status. And in this volume, they examine the trends in time for yield and equity. Volume 2 identifies learning systems that are resilient, those that maintained or promoted the learning and equity and the well-being of the students in the midst of the pandemics. One of the emerging subjects that are examined in Volume 2, and of which I will present some results, is the use of digital technologies at school and out of school, and what's the impact these technologies have in learning. If you've not seen them before, I recommend the reports published by the Inter-American Bank for Development, summaries that are very useful as the PISA results for the region. In these reports that are compared internationally, we don't examine regional differences. The only added average that is included in the report is the average of the OECD countries. Briefly, a description of what PISA is and who participate in PISA. PISA is a test for students of about 15 years of age that measures skills and knowledge in 3 subject matters: mathematics, reading, and sciences. PISA occurs every 3 years. The first edition of PISA was the year 2000, and this evaluation, of which we shall speak today, was the 8th edition of PISA, originally planned for the year 2021, but it was postponed a year due to the pandemics of COVID-19. About 690,000 students of 15 years in 81 countries and economies participated in PISA 2022. This includes 31 countries and economies that have participated in PISA since the beginning. And in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, 14 countries participated. 10 of these countries had already participated previously. 2 of them participated for the first time, in the case of Jamaica and El Salvador, and another 2 countries are united to PISA once the parallel program was started to the main project of PISA, PISA for Development. This is Paraguay and Guatemala. This means that from the very start in the year 2000, the participation of the countries of the region in PISA has tripled from 5 countries to 14 countries. I review the results on academic proficiency. The result of PISA, the main result is there's a global drop in the results of learning in the last decade. This is observed in the areas of mathematics, reading, and science. In mathematics, the average of the OECD countries fell in 15 points in 2018 and 2022. From the start of PISA, the average of the OECD never had varied more than 4 points, increasing or decreasing between one cycle and another cycle of PISA. These are 2 consecutive cycles. So this fall of 15 points has no precedence in the last 2 decades of PISA. If we look and in the long term, we may observe that the average in mathematics reaches a peak in the year 2009, and then there's stagnation with a decline. And in many countries, we observe that the fall in the performance was previous to 2018. This is only to say that not all the drops that we observe in mathematics and in reading, it's the same, can be attributed as the COVID crisis. There were many countries with a previous fall. In reading, the panorama is more or less the same. It falls in 10 points. Never before had there been a change of more than 5 points in reading between 2 consecutive cycles. A fall of 10 points is one without precedence in the story of PISA. If we look in the long term, we see from 2012, there's a clear trend. This was the only subject matter where there is no significant change between 2018 and 2022 in the OCTE. The case of sciences, as you may see, it fell since 2012, and it stabilizes in this more recent period. This is the global aspect that we have observed. If we look at the trends in the countries of Latin America, I don't have a regional average, but I have the short-term changes between 2018 and 2022 for matters of mathematics, reading, and sciences for each one of the countries that participated, and that have data to have a comparison between both cycles. Those that have just joined PISA have no point of comparison. What we see here is that there's contrast between what is seen in the OECD countries. There's a great majority with negative results and strong falls. And in Latin America, where the panorama is more heterogeneous. In the slides you're looking at now, there's a problem that does not distinguish countries where the change was not statistically important. But I can say what we see here is that there are some countries showing a performance, a fall in the performance. There's a drop in the performance in a majority of countries that are stable, and a few that increased their performance between 2018 and 2022. In the case of mathematics, there are 4 countries whose performance falls: Costa Rica, Mexico, Paraguay. These are countries that have comparable data, and 3 countries that increased, with the Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and Guatemala. Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Uruguay maintain themselves stable. In reading, most of the countries are stable and only Costa Rica drops. In sciences, there are 5 countries that go up, 6 countries that maintain stable, and Mexico is the only one with a significant drop. Said in other words, the countries that have a positive trend, if one looks at the 3 subject matters, the Dominican Republic goes up in the 4 subjects, Guatemala and Paraguay in 2, and they don't drop in the 3rd. These are the countries that have a positive way of developing in the short term. The countries that are more negative are Peru, that falls in 1 but does not improve in any of the tests. Costa Rica and Mexico that fall in 2 and do not improve in any area. Argentina, Brazil, and Colombia do not change in any subject matter, and Uruguay goes up in 1 and falls in another.
Ese es el panorama de corto plazo.
This is the short-term panorama. Here we see the long-term trends with 1 point that shows the average of each country in each PISA cycle that they have participated. And the numbers that are beside the names are those that show an average trend of the country. Peru, Brazil, and Colombia have improvements in mathematics. These are the results of mathematics from the first participation in PISA, where the case of Peru is interesting. As you may observe, since 2012, they had a upgrading pathway. Since 2018 to 2022, Uruguay and Costa Rica have a worse development in mathematics. The rest of the countries do not show significant changes in general. In the case of Chile, for example, in the year 2006, it had an improvement in comparison to 2009. It continued with an improvement, but the results in 2015 to 2018 start to drop. It's more or less a curve where they've gone backwards in comparison to the advances that had been shown previously. There are some cases that are interesting to comment. For instance, Paraguay. Unfortunately, has not been included in this graph. Paraguay. This is the reason why it is not included in these trends, has only 2 points. We're comparing PISA for development and PISA 2022. And in Paraguay, there has been an increase of the coverage that is important in this period.
Given that this is the case, that the new students that join the educational system tend to come from socioeconomic realities or that are difficult or face marginal situations for whatever reason, when they join the educational system, at the beginning, they have low performances. That is, when there is a change in the coverage, when we observe the performance trends, those countries that have increased their coverage, at the same time, their average tends to underestimate the path of that country. So we have modeled which would the results be if that increase in coverage hadn't taken place. In the case of Uruguay, Brazil, Colombia, and Costa Rica, where this applies, that is, they have had a significant increase in the coverage. In all of them, the results had been better, would have been better than if that increase in coverage hadn't taken place. That is, it would seem at a first glance that the quality of the education, if we control by this factor, the specific path is better than the other groups had, if we control for that factor. Having said that, which is the overall panorama? Which is the ranking in mathematics performance in Latin America? The average of the OECD was 472 points. The educational system with best performance was Singapore with 575 points, and it's over 20 points above the following, which is Macau in China, Taipei, Hong Kong, and Japan and Korea. As you can see, all the countries that are heading the ranking are Asian countries. And below the OECD average, Chile and Uruguay are the ones that have the best average. The difference is not significant, actually. Those 3 points, Chile and Uruguay have comparable results. Then Mexico and Peru, between the two, they have a comparable performance, but lower than the one of Chile and Uruguay. Then we have the group of Costa Rica, Brazil, and Argentina, Colombia, and Jamaica. And then we have Panama, and finally, Guatemala, Paraguay, and El Salvador. So even though there are countries that in terms of trends are heterogeneous, some go up, some go down, the average level of Latin American countries continues to be clearly quite lower than the average of the OECD and than the countries that have a higher performance. This is the average score of each educational system, an indicator that is correlated with the average, but here we should see which percentage of students reach the minimum levels of learning in each subject matter. In PISA, we say that level 2 is a minimum level of proficiency or capacities and knowledge in math. And what we see here is that in Latin American countries, in math, you can see them with light blue lines in the graph. Those are the ones that have a lower percentage of students above this line. Particularly in the end of the slide, we can see Dominican Republic and El Salvador, Guatemala, Paraguay, Panama, if we continue to move to the right. So clearly here we have an important challenge. It's not that simply the average of the performance is lower than in the international setting, but the percentage of students that have very low performance is very high. And that might bring about all sorts of consequences, not only for those students, but the society at large in the future. This is a different way of understanding low performance. Students that have low performance in one subject matter might have low performance in another subject matter. So this graph, which is included in the report, shows the overlap. What percentage of students have low performance in one, two, or three subject matters? And there is something else, and this is related with the percentages of coverage in each country. In the countries where the percentage of coverage in secondary education is lower, that is where there are more 15-year-olds that are not at school, those students are not represented in the sample of the PISA test. And this is an analysis with the assumption that those students that are not included in the PISA sample, if they took the test, they would reach a level under level 2. So that gives an idea, a more realistic idea of the total 15-year-old students. And this is where the percentages of low performance reach percentages close to 90%, 80%, where really things become dramatic. The level of competences of the 15-year-olds as a whole becomes dramatic. Equity in education, gaps per socioeconomic level. This is not a surprise. In all the countries that participate in PISA, there are important differences in the score by socioeconomic level. These are PISA measures socioeconomic levels through an index that takes into account the educational level of the parents, occupational status of the parents, and wealth of the family, a proxy of the wealth of the family. It shows the deciles of that socioeconomic level and gives an idea of the socioeconomic level of the different countries participating in PISA. Maybe it doesn't come as a surprise that Chile and Uruguay have an average that is a little bit higher than countries like Dominican Republic and Paraguay. If we look at the two ends, given that there are socioeconomic level differences and financial and educational resources for the students of the different countries. This graph combines the two most important dimensions of the volume, equity and performance, and shows that there are countries in the right quadrant, in the top of the right quadrant, that have a high level of equity and performance. Latin American countries, none reaches high levels of performance. They are all in the lower boxes, and they vary in terms of the level of equity measured as which is the predictive value of the socioeconomic level with regard to mathematics learning. So the challenge of the countries, depending from each country, the challenge, those that have high levels of equity, then the challenge is to increase their performance levels. Those that have low levels of equity and performance, like in the case of Colombia, for instance, then they need to go up in both dimensions. In general terms, in the last decade, the socioeconomic gap has remained relatively stable. These are the countries where you can compare results in the last 10 years. That in the case of Argentina and Mexico, it remains stable. In the case of Brazil, Colombia, it remains stable. And Dominican Republic, it remains stable. In the case of Chile and Uruguay, and in the case of Peru, the socioeconomic gap drops. It's also interesting to understand the reasons why this happens. And what we see in the case of Chile and Uruguay is that the performance of the highest socioeconomic level drops, and those that have lower socioeconomic level remain stable. Their performance remains stable. So in an ideal world, one would expect that the gaps would decrease and then all students would go up, but the ones that were in a lower position catch up with those that were in a higher position. Some of the factors that explain beyond the individual characteristics, we have school factors that have an impact upon the difference according to socioeconomic level. Two factors that are correlated with the performance are the level, or if we put it the other way around, how sufficient and good quality are the resources available in the schools that the students of higher and lower socioeconomic levels attend. In all the countries of the region, in the schools at lower socioeconomic level, the level of scarcity in terms of human resources, that is, teachers and other professionals that work at schools, the scarcity is greater in those that have lower socioeconomic level. And also there's a greater scarcity in pedagogical material available for teaching, including the infrastructure of the schools. The study also takes into account the percentage of resilient students in the different subject matters and in mathematics particularly. Here we have some countries of Latin America that show a higher percentage of resilient studies that are defined as those that come from low socioeconomic level, but that nonetheless reach high performance levels as compared with the other students of their own level. Jamaica, Chile, Dominican Republic, and Paraguay are the ones that have levels a little bit higher than the average of the OECD. Very briefly, I don't have much time left. I will speak about migrants in the OECD. There was an increase in the last decade in the percentage of students that are migrants. This we can see in the case of Chile and Costa Rica mainly. In the case of Chile, 1% in PISA 2012, and that moved up to 7% for PISA 2022. I'm not showing it here, but it's interesting that 6% of that 7% are first-generation students. That is, they were born in other countries, and they come at some point of their schooling to the other country and to the educational system that receives them. And half of those students, in the case of Chile, arrive when they are over 12 years of age. That is, they arrive quite late in the schooling process, which poses additional challenges in terms of their assimilation and incorporation.
Now, with regard to the OECD average, it's quite clear that the socioeconomic level of immigrant students is lower, and this is across the board in Latin America. This, again, is in part due to the fact that the percentage of immigrant students in many of these countries is quite low.
Dicho eso,
Having said that,
hay una brecha
there is a gap,
que se observa a nivel de
as
OECD,
one can see at the OECD level and in most of the Latin American countries, for non-immigrant students with the best performance.
pero, y esto es un resultado
And
interesante,
these are interesting results.
es un modelo que hicimos de cuál sería el
We
resultado
rolled out a
de
model
la
to
diferencia
understand
PISA
the results in learning
socioeconómico
outcomes if you control it by the socioeconomic level of immigrant students, or if you control it by the language spoken at home.
en los países
And this
europeos,
primarily in the European countries,
aproximadamente la mitad
where
de
approximately half
los estudiantes de origen inmigrante
the immigrant
habla en casa
students
una lengua distinta
speak
a la que se habla en la
a
escuela.
different language at home than the one spoken at school. And here,
Tenían
two
tamaño suficiente para
countries
hacer esta
had
hipótesis.
a large enough sample to conduct this analysis. And
Controla por esos datos.
if the OECD says if you conduct this indicator, if you figure out this indicator based on those two controls,
Ventaja lingüística. En promedio, en la
on average in the OECD, the difference is slight.
controlan por esos factores
Again, when you control using these two factors.
que tienen
And this is for several countries with a large
de estudiantes inmigrantes
student
desaparece completamente.
immigrant population. It actually, the difference disappears entirely. And then again, there are other countries, for example, Canada, the UK, where when you study this based on these differences, the immigrants' results are higher. Now, in Chile and Argentina, Argentina actually is an example where the immigrants have better performance when you apply these two control factors. And in Chile, their performance is still slightly lower, but the gap is closing. Another factor that is not included in that model is school segregation of students from immigrant backgrounds. And the message that PISA would like to convey with this is that clearly there is potential there among those immigrant students if you were to have specific policies to support that population group. If those policies existed, the potential of these students would be greater. And with this, I would like to close. There's another aspect related to digital resources available at school. This refers to the time used by students when students use digital resources at school during class time for learning activities and during free time, always at school. In most of the cases, the proportion is similar. In some of the countries, higher than the OECD average, or lower than the OECD average. And the most relevant finding here is that there is a high correlation between the use and frequency of use of digital resources and concentration. There are two sources here. And from the concentration of students using these resources and the lack of concentration of students who don't use these resources, but whose peers are using these resources. Students in Uruguay, Argentina, and Chile have said that their level of distraction is higher than any other country that took part in PISA. So that's an interesting regional issue. And in Costa Rica and Brazil and Paraguay, it's higher as well than it is in the OECD, for the OECD average. Anyhow, that's a regional issue that apparently is worth delving into. The level of distraction among students regarding digital use resources. Now, here we have another graph talking about the use of digital resources in school and mathematics performance. Now, this refers to when technology used for learning in the classroom, the
rendimiento en matemáticas para aquellos que
average
no le usan
performance
absoluto
in
y
math
aquellos que
for
le
children
usan
who
por
do
una
not
hora
use them at all versus children who use them for an hour
Es
is
decir,
higher than it is for children who use them for an hour.
sugiere
In other words, this suggests that
un uso limitado
limited,
y
moderate
enfocado
use
al aprendizaje
and use focused on learning
puede generar,
may
em,
actually
puede ser positivo para el
be
aprendizaje.
positive
Luego,
for the learning experience.
más de una hora en realidad no hay evidencia de que esto
And
sí
there is no
tenga,
evidence that use for more than an hour
correlacionado con aprender.
has an ongoing higher correlation with positive learning outcomes.
¿Qué tanto los
In
usan
fact, we see that when assessing how often the children use these digital resources in school during free time, there is
de uso y los resultados de
a
aprendizaje?
drop in learning outcomes. So the more they use them, the
También
higher the drop in learning outcomes is. Here we also have
ansiedad o nerviosismo
issues related to anxiety or being nervous when these students do not have the digital devices near them.
países de América Latina,
Again, in the Latin American countries, the students state that
mientras más tiempo no tienen
the longer they are
estos dispositivos
not,
cerca, mayor es su nivel de nerviosismo o
the longer they do not have their
ansiedad
device
nerviosa
nearby them,
mayor.
their level of anxiety increases.
Y bueno, hay una correlación negativa entre
And then there's a negative correlation with the higher level of nervousness and anxiety and performance. And there's a negative correlation between nervousness and anxiety and the use of these resources or devices and another series of social emotional well-being indicators such as this satisfaction with life, emotional control, or resistance to stress.
Lo voy a dejar ahí, entonces esto es una invitación
I'm just going to leave that out for you. This is an invitation as well for you
consultar y
to
los
look
informes
into this and to read the report.
publicados.
Next year, we will be publishing 3 additional reports, one on creative thinking. This was a special task that was actually rolled out this year. And then there's another one on financial education, which
Ciclos anteriores,
has been published in previous cycles. And then a third document related to students,
a lo largo de la vida,
preparing students for continuous lifelong learning. There is also information there with regard to how current performance is related to students' future outcomes with regard to transitioning toward higher education or from higher education into the labor market, for example. Thank you. Thank you, Danielle, for your interesting presentation. I would like to point out how you mentioned that one of the pillars of social inequalities in this region is reflected in the educational inequalities. For example, the socioeconomic situation and the immigration status, and how this suggests the importance of combining education policies with social policies, such as social protection policies. Moreover, I thought it was very interesting to see how evidence endorses how you can have educational systems that achieve excellence and equity, and how it is important to come up with clear guidelines with regard to the use of digital resources at school, on the one hand, to maximize their impact on learning, while also minimizing their negative impact on social, emotional well-being. We are a bit behind time, but we still would like to provide you with an opportunity to ask any burning questions for the speakers. Again, we will only have time for 2 questions from the individuals in-house and 2 on the chat. Go ahead. Please state your name. Good morning, Vanilla Alexandra. I have worked for a long time with students, but mostly higher education students, and we work in the Learning Advancement Group. I have a question for the speakers presenting on the PISA outcomes. I have a question that refers to the high level of school dropout rates showed by Chile in the post-pandemic period. This was 45,000 students dropping out from the school sector in 2022. I guess this slightly improved in 2023 when 17,000 of those children went back to school. What impact did this have on their learning, according to PISA? That is the students who dropped out, but those who have returned. How, according to the report, how did this affect their learning experience? Let's take the two questions and then the chat questions, and then we can answer them. Any other questions? Trinidad Valdez from the University of Los Andes School of Education. Now, the global drop in learning outcomes over the last decade has been quite stable, correct? It seems as though coverage is increased, but learning stagnant. Are there any experiences of countries that have increased coverage and increased their learning outcomes so that we could perhaps focus on an education system that would be exemplary or the course to follow?
Hola.
Hi there.
Ambos preguntas
All
tienen
right, both questions are related to something quite similar in that there is a relationship between coverage and learning outcomes. The assessment that we included in the report, and again, I feel more comfortable describing this, was primarily for those countries with a low level of coverage and that have had a significant increase in coverage over time, over the last 10 or 20 years, that is. Chile is not one of the countries that has the lowest coverage. The data you refer to, I don't know exactly what your source of data is, information. I'm sure it's a reliable source, but nonetheless, the period is quite recent. You mentioned changing coverage from the pandemic. Well, in other words, over the last 2 to 3 years. PISA does not have our data go back to 2018 to 2022, and maybe even further back, correct? So in the case of Chile, based on the PISA outcomes, I do not believe there has been a significant increase in education coverage between 2018 and 2022. With regard to the second question, are there comparative opportunities here? When you compare with those countries that have higher performance, for example, those countries really do not have any coverage issues. If you wanted to compare with those countries, you would see they don't have any coverage issues. So I couldn't say that there was an increase in outcomes side by side with an increase in coverage, because for quite a while now, these countries have had universal coverage for secondary education. What about Estonia? Perhaps that's a country that's easier to compare with Chile. They've seen improvements. Well, I would have to study that. I'm not familiar with the Estonia case right now, but I could look into that and I could see which countries with high performance have had increased coverage. I don't know. So off the top of my head, I do not have that information, but I would like to point out the case of some of the Latin American countries. Paraguay, for example, has had improvements from 2018 to 2022 in all three subject matters.
Brazil had an increase in the last decade, and it also has shown improvement. And Costa Rica has gone from a 50% to a 70% coverage. In long term, has had an increase in learning. Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to read two comments that we have seen in the chat by Zoom, where we have been accompanied in this launching so that you can reflect on them. The first one, important findings that continue seeing a deficit in the educational system, accompanied by an acknowledgement of asymmetries and inequalities of a structural type in between countries and amongst countries. PISA makes us think in multidimensional, where education is accompanied by nutrition, health, economic stability of the home, the care and wellness of the caretakers, and other factors that are important in the educational development. The second comment says that the educational system with economic factors sees how our crisis is affected in a heterogeneous way, the interventions in political areas that are lacking in effectivity. I don't know if you can deliberate on these comments. Please, Daniela, 3 minutes more or less, and then Daniel. Thank you, Mariana, and thank all the people that have accompanied us online that have given many comments and consultations that are interesting. I hope we can continue in contact further on to work on these different subjects. The comments precisely show us the importance of the multidimensionality of inequality in our region, as well as the way in how we have to cope with this educational transformation. From ECLAC, we have been saying that education is not resolved only by education, especially when one reaches levels of coverage that are higher, as I mentioned, or when you advance in an important way, the problems become more complex to be resolved only from the point of view of education. It is important to have integral strategies that look at the life cycle of the people, that is centered on people and that sees the different needs according to the situation of certain groups. To have articulated strategies, as was commented, such as the health sector, that includes mental health, that has been observed as an important element throughout the pandemics, and where the schools today, when going back to presence, need extra schooling activities to support the different educational levels. This would be one thing that is important to point out. And with an increase, for instance, of the situation of unemployment or poverty in the different homes, we must accompany the policies in education with social protection and income protection in the homes. And this is important in foreseeing or reducing school dropouts. The strategies of accompanying caretakers that were also pointed out in the comment seems interesting to me, and in the first years of life, to accompany the caretakers in the caretaking in first infancy and educational programs seems important to point out. We can think in a series of multidimensional and multisectorial strategies to cope with this educational crisis of many of our countries. Thank you very much. I would like to end with 2 points in educational policy. One, is it important to see the reasons why the countries of Latin America have a level of performance below those results of the OECD? Something mentioned by Daniela in her presentation, the level of investment per student is less. This is given in good measure that the richer countries have a budget with more possibilities to invest per student. The average of the OECD in investment per student is higher, clearly, And what we present in the study, we have a table that shows the correlation between the investment per student and the level of performance. And we see that there is a correlation that is important and strong up to a certain point that still has not been reached by any of the countries of Latin America, after which the correlation becomes nil. What does this mean? Certainly, there's a minimum floor of infrastructure and resources, quality information of teachers that is required to reach a threshold of educational quality. And maybe it becomes clearer and clearer that the key is in the use of resources. The countries that have the higher levels of development vary significant in terms of how much they invest, and none of them is below a certain threshold where we find all the Latin American countries under that threshold. There's an enormous space for Latin American countries to continue to invest and continue investing where these resources make a difference. A second point that I would like to touch upon PISA throughout its multiple studies has observed what are the policies that characterize educational systems with a higher performance. And I would like to mention three areas that are important. One of them is that these are countries with a teaching profession that is very good and very strong. It is attractive for the best students of secondary education to study pedagogy and become professors because there's a possibility of development throughout their careers that is interesting. At the schools, there is a possibility of cooperation, of pedagogical innovation, and there is a high social acknowledgement of professors in these countries. The second area deals with early education. We have preschooling education of high quality, and this is clearly observed in the PISA data. Those students that have experimented this education have a better development at 15 years, even controlling with other factors as economic factors. And the third subject, especially in Latin America, all that deals with the allocation of resources in the country for those students that need these resources most, with low performance students or a low socioeconomic level. What type of specific support are these students receiving to compensate the lack of resources that come from home? Thank you very much, Daniela and Daniel. Before giving the floor to Carlos Enriquez from the Regional Office of UNESCO in Santiago, I would like to thank all those present, the presenters, those more than 500 people that are virtually connected to our meeting. Outside, there are files per country for those that wish to know more about the situation of each country related to PISA, and there's material and presentations in the page of the event that you can unload. And as evaluation of the event, also that you are requested to respond. It will be not only here in the room, but also in the chat, and this is information that is very useful for us. Carlos, you have the floor. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where each one of you are. It is an honor for me to contribute in the organization of the authorities of OECD, ECLAC, and the participation of UNESCO and YESE to present a great panel thanking the effort for those that inaugurate the speakers, Daniela Truco, for giving us a regional context in public policies and investment of needs of the region to invest more in education from a heterogeneous standpoint, and from the presentation of Daniel Salinas in OECD for this effort, not only at a global level, but also regional in terms to make it contextualized. I have good colleagues in this conversation that will be able to contribute to this general glance, and of each countries I present Clara Machado da Silva, General Coordinator of the Evaluation of Education, Basic Education from INEP in Brazil. Welcome, Clara. Silvia Schnelkes, researcher in education, not only of Mexico, but also for the region in different subjects. Thank you, Silvia, for coming and for an important trip of reaching the southmost region in the area. Claudia Matos in the Agency of Quality of Education in Chile and support for the region with the work, dealing with the work of PISA and support for the different countries. Thank you very much, Claudia, for being with us today. Gina Garces, Director of Evaluation of the Ministry of Education of Panama. Thank you, Gina, for being here and accompanying us in this panel. And Ezequiel Molina, Senior Economist of the World Bank. Welcome and thank you. We have 6 minutes to be able to respond the same question. And from such a perspective, see everything that is important shown to us by Daniel, and specifically this scenario of many countries of Latin America and the Caribbean, and also your countries. We have participated in different cycles of PISA, some from the start, such as the case of Chile and Brazil. Others have joined us later on, with a series of applications, such as the case of Panama. But the data show us that the results of learning have been stagnated, relatively low since 2012, as has been pointed out to us by Daniel. 3 of every 4 in mathematics as in level 1, and they don't surpass this minimum level of competencies and skills. Can you refer to what are the main educational challenges in the countries that don't allow us to improve the results following this line, and how they could face from their countries and from the region this permanent crisis of learning to give a jump and experiment improvements? Clara from Brazil, your 6 minutes. Thank you, Carlos. It is an honor to be with all of you here. As Daniela, the inequality in the region is something that is fundamental, and this also occurs in Brazil. In the educational context, one of the ways that we are searching to face this is through the implementation of a national curriculum. We are doing this since 2017. So a set has been implemented of minimum opportunities that is especially important in a country such as mine, that is long and diverse. In secondary education, this also is a restructuring of teaching with more time at school and a common basis, but also with the possibility of a choice of the students of areas of interest, so that school should come close to real life. The interests should be closer of the challenges of the working market and coexistence in society.
But for that purpose, another challenge that is very important is training teachers. Because if we have this transformation, we do have this transformation actually, but if we have it and we do not have people interested in becoming teachers, we have high rates of dropouts in graduate courses. We have a higher and higher proportion of online courses for graduate studies. And the truth is that the quality of graduate courses, the teachers are not prepared for in-person plus online. We know what our students are entitled to this quality education. So we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. Thank you very much, Clara, for your perspective from Brazil. And now, Silvia, please, if you could speak about exactly the same from your perspective in Mexico, but also this reflection as regional researcher in this scenario of low performance. Which are the challenges that are what's maybe preventing an improvement in results? What could we do at the level of countries and the region? How can we face in the region this permanent educational crisis, and how can we make a leap from where we're standing? Thank you, Carlos. Thank you to ECLAC for this opportunity. I think that the PISA report confirms that there's an exacerbation of problems and that the pandemic didn't allow us to decrease the problems, and we couldn't make progress towards greater equality. We have low investment, but basically we have an inefficient use and a poor distribution of investment. Daniel mentioned this very clearly already. The fact that, for instance, we still have the level of performance. There's an important dropout during the pandemic. In the case of my country and others in the region, things are settling down. So the performance has remained more or less the same. And this is in my country where 100,000 less in higher education in my country. And also what Clara has just mentioned, the lack of care about the training and updating of teachers. There's a news in my country that the amount of money devoted to teachers updating is equivalent to $5 a year. That is the budget for 2024. So I think that there we have a very important challenge. The money devoted to updating and training of teachers. These causes have not been fought. Maybe that's the pandemic left educational tragedy, and we haven't taken care of that yet. The enormous challenge for me, to me, is the enormous number of students that are under level 2. Most of them in most of our countries. In the case of mathematics, in all our countries, most of the students are under level 2. And I think that is what should worry us the most. On the other hand, this group, in general terms, only decreases in Dominican Republic. It is strengthened in Paraguay. They start at very low levels, and that probably explains the improvement. Remains stable in Colombia, Panama, Uruguay, amongst others, but in Brazil increases 5%, 6% in Argentina, 11% in my country. This group that should worry us because it is a majority. Also, the gaps, as you mentioned, drop between quartiles of socioeconomic development, but not that much either. So it's a good news that they don't increase. but the pandemic prevented us from continuing to make progress in that direction. The greatest challenge for me is that we are not taking care of the base of the pyramid. It represents most of our students, and it reflects a problem that comes from levels before education. And in our countries, this is not being taken care of. So one of the things we have to do is to focus. If we believe that education is what will bring us to equality, then we should focus on educational policy and gear them towards the base of the pyramid. Thank you very much, Silvia, for your contribution. And I would like to continue with Claudia, the perspective in Chile, but the regional perspective as a regional researcher. Understanding these gaps just mentioned by Silvia, 3 out of 4 in the country in math don't reach level 2. Could you please share some examples of measurements that could mitigate these educational inequalities, or maybe that have had some impact regarding this scenario? And also what Silvia and Clara say, how to orient in a better way the investment. Claudia, please. Thank you very much for the invitation. You know that I'm more quantitative in nature, not so much policy, but quantitative in Chile, basically because I believe this might help. A big problem in Latin America is our inequality, economic and cultural inequality. So one of the measures we have to adopt is in that regard. And I fully agree with everything that Silvia said. And one of the things we have to prioritize is those that are in more need, and those are the students that are in the lower levels. But I would like to share with you what we have done in Chile in this regard. And we have 2 laws in Chile. Preferential subsidy applied since 2009 and inclusion law since 2015. Even though Chile has a reasonable result at a regional level, not good, because if we see our projections in science, according to what we invest, we get what we get. That is, the score in science is in the regression line when we do the regression between the resources investment and the results obtained. In reading, we are above that regression line, and in mathematics, we are much below. And that is something that is quite similar around the region. So we should wonder, why do we do much better in reading than in mathematics? I believe it is a problem of related with the teachers. How attractive being a teacher might be, especially for reading and mathematics. In mathematics, in the area of mathematics, other jobs are more interesting than being a mathematics teacher, whereas in language, maybe not so much. So we have to analyze that in more depth. But the 2 laws we have, in 2009, the ESC, the social cultural indicator, explained how 18.7% of the result language, and in 2020 it dropped to half, 9.7. That means that it doesn't matter so much which was the educational level of the family of the school in my results, because it dropped to half. And social inclusion measured by the OECD dropped. Well, in the lack of inclusion dropped, which was more or less how much of the structure of the system in the socio-economic index dropped from not explaining 48.6. Now inclusion went up to 63%. And it's fundamentally in those two periods that we have these two laws that are enforced. And this is applied in, or that is reflected by the fact that the lower group had more diversity, the diversity and the inclusion improved a little bit. And those that deteriorated the most in our country were the students of a high socioeconomic level. So we have to work on inclusion strongly and inclusion of the more disadvantaged students. And we have to prioritize that. We can say, how can we provide support? During the pandemic in Chile, we tried to give teachers more tools, and that worked a little bit. The evaluations were interrupted, but diagnostic evaluations for the students were carried out. It's not that we were successful, not at all, but maybe it was a means to try not to have such a big deterioration in education. So my recommendation is, in the first place, inclusion. The best teachers are not serving the students that need it the most. We still have the best teachers that have better socioeconomic levels and that promote segregation. Chile continues to be a country that is quite segregated. That is why 7% of the population goes to private schools, but it's only 7% that can choose to education that should be good, but it's not that good. But anyway, for most of the students, it is necessary to try to improve the quality of the teachers. We see that teachers of reading in Chile, they've had the same challenges as the math teachers, but they have attained better results. So we have to find out what is it that those teachers are doing well, because there's no purpose in going and see what European countries are doing. We have to use our own strengths to overcome our weaknesses. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Claudia, for that contribution and for that perspective from Chile, keeping with the rest of the colleagues. In order to continue, allow me to give the floor to Gina Garces. She's the Director of Educational Evaluation for the Ministry of Education in Panama. She will refer to poor student performance. 3 out of 4 students' performance in Central America and in the Caribbean is very low. And then some countries, actually 9 out of 10 students have poor performance. In any event, perhaps you could refer to some specific examples that you have employed, examples of measures that you have employed to mitigate these issues? Have you had any results, for example, and how could you guide us to best address the future going forward? Thank you. Thank you, Carlos and ECLAC, for the invitation. Of course, as mentioned by Danielle in his presentation, in the case of Panama, with regard to reading, we were the first country on the table in Latin American region. And from 2016, once we conducted our national test called Crecer, we began focusing on reading skills because that was our Achilles heel. We recognized that. So we came up with an intervention plan that was aimed at educational establishments that had the worst performance. obviously, based on those results, we are focusing our attention on those specific educational establishments. And we have maintained this. This has been steady across the months and over the years. And so it's important to maintain public policy. Once you identify that there are good measures, it's important to maintain these regardless of changes in the administration. So what are we trying to do with that? Well, we are trying to boost teacher training so that we can ensure continuous training, education. Now in Panama, the teachers in place will be there for a while. So we have to accept the fact that they will be with us for 20 years, and those to participating in the next PISA program will be those same teachers. So we're trying to boost their teaching skills. With regard to reading, math, and science skills, we have also included social sciences, for example, from first grade to ninth grade. And in that case, we have leveled the students, or attempting to level the students. But this is something that also needs to include the participation of the authorities and the administrative authorities and the leadership at the educational establishments. And then, of course, we have our regional and national supervisors as well. The regional supervisors need to be monitoring what the educational establishments are doing. That is, those that are under their portfolio. In fact, yesterday we were just reviewing a proposal for a digital platform, because we also need to use the digital platforms to post indicators. For example, the number of students trained, whether a number of teachers trained, if the teachers receive the material on time, if the teachers are participating in these practical educational workshops. So in other words, we need to ensure as well that the teachers are exchanging experiences, because we have also recognized that every classroom is unique and every educational establishment is unique, even though they may be located in one single region. So in other words, to bring about change, you need to address the system as a whole. You have to work with the central level authorities and the educational establishment level authorities. So clearly there are challenges that we continue to face as authorities with regard to how to best use the outcomes of these studies. And as we know, we encourage teachers to reach level 3, 4, and 5 as defined by the OECD. So teachers know that we need to work within these learning taxonomy codes and focus on the higher and lower levels. And we know that teachers are key. Teachers are at the heart of all of this. And teacher training is relevant. We know that. I also agree with Claudia. We need to look in the mirrors. We as countries need to look at ourselves and be able to identify what our specific needs are. And to that end, we need to conduct investigative studies, research, and disseminate these so that we know exactly where we need to place our sites. And let me close by saying how important it is to constantly have a stronger and stronger evaluation system. We have worked in Panama on different projects. And for example, we're also working with UNESCO on having our ERSE schools. It's a small group of ERSE schools. It's a regional comparative and exploratory study school. And so the tests are applied, we get the results, and we immediately put these results back into the feedback loop and monitor. And so it's very practical, because the schools like this, because they have the test results, they publish the test results, they use these results as feedback to bring about change. So it's critical to work closely with the educational establishments to boost educational outcomes in Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you. Thank you, Gina. Well, at least we have consensus this first time around. I would like to thank all of you who have taken part in this discussion and who are willing to be part of the solution with regard to PISA and the regional approach. Allow me to briefly refer to what Brazil is doing in terms of the national curriculum. It's important to refer to the opportunities there and how there are areas of common interest. And I think there are some key elements worth addressing there in terms of what PISA results say and what ERSA says, and what we've also heard about teacher training and the importance of supporting teachers. This also links up to what Sylvia said in terms of the root causes, such as low investment in teacher training and these stable results as a result of that. We also heard from Danielle with regard to students outside of the system, and also with regard to the need to prioritize those individuals with the worst learning outcomes. And I agree with Claudia and with regard to CEP in Chile and the inclusion law and with the progress that regard. And as well with what Gina said with regard to the need to focus on new teachers and ongoing teacher training, providing support and using resources to better leverage learning outcomes and to focus on teacher improvement in that overall discussion. Now, allow me to invite the panelists with their regional perspective to perhaps take 4 minutes to refer to technology, perhaps post-pandemic technology. Actually, I would like to apologize profoundly to the final speaker. I inadvertently left out Ezequiel Molina. You are the last speaker to refer to opportunity in terms of lessons and boosting learnings from the World Bank, senior economist. Well, first of all, on behalf of the World Bank, we would like to thank you for the invitation and thank the various colleagues for their excellent presentations and for their opinions expressed here thus far, because I think it's very positive to have a consensus with regard to the assessment and the policies that need to be adopted. As Andrea said early on, PISA is the most important large-scale international assessment for students aged 15 year across the globe. And this is a very unique opportunity for governments to better understand the students' skills in terms of reading, math, and science. Now, PISA 2022 is even more important because this is the first large-scale international assessment post-pandemic, and this allows us to see the situation of 14 countries within the LAC region. Allow me to begin with 3 comments with regard to the diagnostic or the assessment that I would like to focus on, that the meeting has centered around. I think it's all very important, and this is something that perhaps we can all leave here with a takeaway. First of all, 15-year-olds are facing a profound learning crisis with market economic disparities in the majority of the Latin American and Caribbean nations, as mentioned by Danielle and as mentioned by the other colleagues. On average, in the region, 75% of these students have results that are less than basic mathematical skills, and 50% of the students have results that are lower than they should be for their grade for reading. And when we address the socio-demographic variables, we have also seen that these results are further exacerbated. This is very important. It's important to know that from a structural perspective, there is an in-depth crisis that did not begin yesterday. We know that. And secondly, the learning outcomes are not headed in the right direction. If you look at mathematics, for example, and you compare the two, and when you look at the 2018 to 2022 rounds, as 7 out of 10 countries are worse off with regard to basic skill sets. And if you assess 2009 to current date, with the exception of Peru, the percentage of students under the minimal skill level was maintained as such or worsened in all the countries throughout the region, with the exception of Peru, as mentioned. And finally, the third comment or assessment, which is something we have not discussed that much. I think Claudia Uribe mentioned this early on, and it is that these are the results of 15-year-olds. But when you assess what's happening in primary education, the pandemic-related losses jump out at us because many of the children have not had access to early childhood education. And these impacts will be seen further down the road in the future PISA outcomes. We, as mentioned, will see in future PISA outcomes, we will see the impact of not having the best opportunities in early childhood education. So with regard to these challenges, what can we do? And again, I agree with everything that is said thus far. We believe that it is imperative to adopt immediate action to counteract the lessons, the learnings lost in mathematics and reading. And for example, working with tutors is one way to level up, or working with educational resources to level up and to meet the necessary outcomes. We also think it's extremely important to continue to underscore efforts to recover and to bounce back students' outcomes in primary education for reading and math, so that when they take the PISA test, they will have recovered part of what they had lost during the pandemic. Now, all of this, obviously, as we have already said, calls for investing more in teacher training. In Latin America, in particular, we need to move towards teacher training that is aligned with the teacher's needs. It needs to be practical, ongoing. It needs to be focused on specific skills. Clearly, that's a significant challenge, and this challenge it was not born during the pandemic, rather prior to that. And we still have a great deal of terrain to cover before we reach those outcomes. And we also need to make sure that teachers have digital skills, that they may be able to employ all the various learning methodologies that are most effective. And again, this is not easy. We cannot leave them to their own devices. Rather, we need to support them, and we need to provide them with student performance data to support them and provide them with teacher training, and also try to measure the quality of teacher performance in the classroom in order to make improvements. And then finally, I also believe it's important to continue doing what PISA has been doing thus far to reinforce learning assessment systems. I believe this is essential. We know that some countries have faced difficulties with regard to technical standards, and we would like for when we hold the next PISA in 2025, I would like to see more than 14 countries participating. I would like to see the largest number of Latin American, Caribbean countries participating. I think that's what we would all like to see. We would all like to help the countries make improvements and boost their evaluation systems. And finally, it was mentioned that policies cannot be implemented unless they have the necessary resources earmarked for them. I hope that this launching opportunity is heard. What we have discussed today has been heard by the ministries of finance, in addition to the ministries of education. We need to invest more. And we also know that, according to the PISA data, that this is not the only step we need to take. We need to invest more and invest better. And we need to know what we need to do in order to invest better and to make sure that the resources invested actually bring about positive outcomes. And with this, I would like to conclude. I also believe we have an opportunity here. Today, we are launching the results, and the world is just now trying to figure out, interpret these data. Danielle had an excellent presentation as to how to interpret the data. And I think that we have a great deal of work ahead of us to better understand this assessment in a systematic fashion, understand what's going on in terms of equity. It's important to understand the factors during the pandemic that led to losses in learning. In other words, these results, perhaps we expected more losses. Therefore, we need to better understand the attenuating circumstances and as such allow to have better policies in Latin America. We are working on a study with the Inter-American Development Bank to assess these aspects. And I also think it's important to underscore the ministerial summit that will be held here in Santiago next January to refer to the success stories in the region so that we may begin consolidating better learning. And finally, I have noticed that this is a significant effort put forth by the countries, and we are very pleased to be here, very pleased to figure out how we can contribute to this effort and to together work towards policies that will allow us to take the necessary corrective measures, all with a view to improving education in the countries throughout the region. Thank you.
Gracias, Ezequiel.
Thank you, Ezequiel, for your contribution and this glance of understanding the diagnosis much better with a greater production in that line, and your words that our office, UNESCO, together with ECLAC, UNICEF, the World Bank, with CAF and IDB and other institutions, is organizing this ministerial meeting in January to have educational transformations that can take this as a diagnosis for better policies in the educational field. The primary that you mentioned, to thank all the efforts, as these are 20 countries that are being part of the ERCE 2025. Mexico participates with Nueva León, and to all countries Spanish-speaking outside of Brazil and the incorporation of Venezuela are having information on 2025 of all the region in terms of what is primary. For the last block, I would like to invite you in terms of being able to see the opportunities on educational transformation, as Daniel pointed out, and technology. The educational systems suffered important transformations in the pandemics. And what happened in learning not only is in the schoolrooms, there are other ways of learning, not in the most traditional way. Technology plays its role, and there are limitations that have been pointed out by the study. And what you would think are the best lessons learned in your cases of what you've observed in the different countries in the changes produced by COVID, the ways of learning, new ways of teaching, and how you incorporated this in the educational systems that could be an opportunity in terms of this improvement that we finally wish to happen. Clara from Brazil. Thank you, Carlos. An important framework of the pandemics has been the adaptation of virtual formats. In Brazil, technology, however, is not something that has been consolidated as an educational tool. After the pandemics, we have 58% of the schools in Brazil with computers and internet available for the students. 58. So this is not too much when in the pandemics, every student needed resources such as these. Though the present society is completely immediate for technology, digital technologies, the schools are not included in this context completely. And we see that in PISA, in Brazil, 45% of the students reported that the use of a telephone is a distraction in mathematics lessons, and they get distracted with the use of their colleagues of the telephone in classes. So if you see the use of technology is not consolidated as an educational system, the penetration of these resources in school life has not existed in potentiating teaching. It can be done in Brazil, and we know how to do it because we've done it for nearly 2 years. The schools were closed, and the challenge now is to know how much fits in to this new format that is presential, but we have all these resources, and it is highly positive that PISA teaches that the use guided and limited is very positive for learning. Now, we have to know the limits of knowing how to work with these tools, incentivate them through public policies, as our schools in Brazil are not prepared to have the technology as an educational tool with equity. We know where the computers are. They are in schools with a socio-economical level that is higher, and they are tools that need to be at the availability of everyone. Thank you, Clara. Silvia, you're recognized researcher from Mexico on the same subject. What learnings could we have due to the teachings of COVID, and how these can be incorporated in our educational systems? Thank you, Carlos. I would like to make reference to three things. First, technology. It's one of the important experiences of COVID was how teachers were able to use the technologies after we had tried this throughout 2 decades and we had not been able to do it. They did it in a short period of time, and this is something that we have to make use. Always the question is that this should be not another cause of inequality, technology, I mean, because it was in the pandemics. We know it was a cause that was added to all the previous causes because of lack of connectivity and equipment. Many students were left outside. We know who they are and what you said, Clara, now. The equipments and the internet are concentrated in schools with higher level of resources. We have to use, we know the technology, the investment in technology is not necessary to buy equipment for buying an equipment when you don't have the support for that equipment assured. This is an integral policy in regards to inclusion and inequity. Another learning of the pandemics that seems fundamental to me is the role of the parents that is relevant in PISA. In the case of Latin America, where there always has been a lack of faith in what is the school and the parents. In the case of the pandemics, parents acknowledge the importance of the teachers and the teachers the importance of the parents. A relationship was born relating learning between parents and school, and we cannot lose this. We have to continue to enjoy this aspect. The third thing I would like to mention is resilient students. It seems very interesting to me, and this is what we would not. Resilient students are the ones that show what are the origins. How did these students, resilient students, do to reach the first quartile of learning if they come from socioeconomical low homes? Is there something that can aid us in identify what are the most resilient and why? Is there something dealing with the public policy, the teachers, preparation? There's an important agenda for research there. One of the things we would have to do in the future is to try and produce the most resilient possible. And for this, one of the things we would have to learn how to do is how to make a pedagogy. There's a lot of learnings in this sense. There's a group or a panel of evaluation based on evidence that makes recommendations to the different countries, and it obtained a specific number dedicated to COVID. How to recover the learnings starting from COVID, and speaking about the need to strengthen the support of teachers that we've all mentioned. It speaks about the advisability of seeing the students and tend them according to their levels, something that is called in English teaching at the right level. And then to try and accelerate the recovery of the learnings through special classes, additional tasks, work done with the parents, and we make this intelligent use of technology that is available. It's not to invest in equipment if we cannot assure the support, but to focus on an adequate pedagogy that is facilitated by technology and not replaced by it. Technology does not replace pedagogy, it supports it. And to stress what I said a while ago, there are three ways of increasing our proficiency. The first is that they should all improve, which would be ideal. The second, which is the easiest, that they should improve those that are in a better position. And the third, that is to elevate the level. How do we do to increase the performance? Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Silvia.
Thank you, Silvia.
Claudia, mismos temas.
Claudia, the same subjects and same question. What would be the main lessons learned due to COVID, and how can we incorporate it in educational systems? COVID shows us a number of things. First, the most global lessons were that we could, as Silvia said, teachers denied the use of virtual equipment, but in 3 weeks they just had to use them. And that was it, and they did it. As from the point of view of the measurement systems, the agency could have a test in record time diagnosis, so it could help the different establishments that they applied and that they were in charge of. This is one of the things that are important of what we could do. That in spite of what one felt, one of the main lessons is that if we need, we can obtain. Maybe not as beautifully as one would desire, but it is better to do something than not to do anything. We could have results and teachers could do virtual teaching. What if these virtual classes tells us that the students, they don't motivate themselves alone. They have problems to motivate when they are working virtually. This is one of the lessons we have to learn. How to motivate students, especially in Chile. Many complain more than in the OECD that they don't have support, and there was a family support, but they need even more support from the school and from other sites. The problem in Chile, there was interruptions, a support to the teachers themselves. They also complained that they didn't have all the weapons necessary. So this is one of the lessons we learned. We have to support teachers and the student, both in the same way, because sometimes the teacher didn't know as much as the student sometimes. If we have to support all this apparatus that was formed, if many students did receive support, they received the equipment, and the schools received equipment, but this has to be maintained. If it is given without support, it is useless. It won't be used. These are the lessons we learned. Thank you. Thank you, Claudia, for the support and your words in what refers to learning. Gina from Panama, how can we incorporate this in the educational systems? Main lessons learned. One, at an institutional level, the need to have the necessary information where the ministry should know where are the students, contact with their parents, because if not, we don't have a database that is strong and rich, we won't be able to locate them. In the case of Panama, they said tomorrow we have a total closing. So where do we search for our students?
Another very important aspect, that the inequity became evident and the inequity between the schools in rural and urban areas. In urban areas, we generated a platform that we are providing to our teachers and that we continue to strengthen. But how do we also make it reach the rural areas? So we're generating a digital strategy plan addressed with accompaniment to the teachers, not that we will just give them computers, we will teach them how to use them as a support instrument. We have to install batteries, we need solar panels, we need many things to bring the technology to those areas that have difficult access. In the areas that are vulnerable, how do we ensure security that the computers will remain there and that they won't vanish? How do we guarantee that? The investment in technology needs many other decisions, and we're working on a plan for that purpose. Teachers training, follow up to the fulfillment of our objectives, attainment of our goals, and how do we define the additional elements for difficult to access areas, and recorded classes also. If the technology doesn't get there, how we can generate classes that can reach those places over the radio or over the TV, to have that at hand also, because we need a resource that can be used. The good thing about that is that now the teacher can go to a link and find how you can teach the parts of a plant or triangles, and has an armamentarium of information at his disposal. We also have accelerated learning program, because through COVID, we realized that there were students in this case that were lagging behind. So what do we do to level those students that were lagging behind? So we generated the accelerated learning plan by offering them the opportunity that they were looking for. We gave them some basic knowledge. Third grade, for instance, didn't come back the following year. Then we give the basic knowledge of third year, and then we also give the knowledge of the fourth grade. So how do we level the students? But to our surprise, students came that had dropped out before COVID. So there is a need in that population that had dropped out to come back to the educational center. And that for us was valuable. We not only leveled those that due to COVID had dropped out, but we also incorporated those that due to different family economic reasons, because they moved to a different region, had also been left out of the school system. We recovered those too. But despite the technology, despite recorded courses, despite the pedagogical guidelines, in the social emotional part, we need to do a key job. We know that nothing replaces the work of a teacher in a classroom. The interaction in the classroom is very important. That human warmth, that accompaniment, that living together in the classroom. Those first grade children that we will see in 2025, how the evolution took place in pandemic years will be fundamental. Thank you very much. Thank you, Gina, for your contribution. And now Ezequiel from the World Bank regarding the main lessons learned and how these have been incorporated in the different countries. Ezequiel, please. I would like to say that the most important things have been said already, so it's difficult to come at the end, but I will try to underline some principles that we believe we learned in terms of using technology to improve education. I think that the main lesson and the first lesson is that technology is not the solution to solve learning. but it can be a solution for specific problems that we have. So once you have that perspective, this won't solve all our problems, but it can solve specific things that are important. For instance, virtual tutors programs have had a great impact in learning, supporting online teachers. In Brazil, there is a case of a very effective program using artificial intelligence, portals centralized to go to the teachers and also to hire teachers. This is something that in Latin America has been done well, but maybe the experiences are not well down. Ecuador, Brazil, Chile, they have adopted these systems, introducing changes that are not very expensive, but generating better results. So I think that the point is, first, we have to ask ourselves, which is the problem we have? And can technology help us solve that problem instead of thinking that we have technology and then afterwards we think about the problems? The second point is that if you invest in technology, you have to invest in training, support, monitoring, and maintenance for it to work, which has been said already, and many times we forget about that. Think about technology as a car. When you just bought it, it's depreciating already. Whereas investing in a teacher that will use that technology, like investing in a house, it will appreciate as the time goes by. These are the characteristics of technology. It will depreciate very fast, and someone has to use that technology for it to be effective. And then think about all the other details, like which are the digital skills that I want my teachers to have? How can I give them to them, give those to them? How can they improve as time goes by? The third point that is also very important, and in the pandemic, it was not that possible because it started overnight. It's to test technology. Moving into the future, many of the frustrations with technology is not to have tested sufficiently the technology to realize that it was not the solution for that specific problem, that is difficult to escalate when you do not have connectivity, or other specific problems. The more you test, then the problems and the solutions become more clear. And finally, I think that another point I share with my colleagues is that when you use technology, especially when you use it to change the way in which the teachers interact with the students, the teachers have to be there around the table to discuss which is the best way to do this, because they are the ones who know how to do it, and they are the ones that are going to do it. And also because if they don't agree, it won't be used, and the government will be wasting money. So take that into account, and working on that will lead to much better results. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much, Ezequiel. I think that Ezequiel has summed up in 4 points all what technology entails. And to close and go back to our host, I would like to thank the panel. And technology is not the solution to learning, but it can be a great help. And as Clara said, we have enormous inequality. It has to be a right for the students, and it is a task we have in the region. And this strengthens what Sylvia said, how to use comprehensive policies. And I love the case of how to make public policies pedagogical, not only because there are inequalities between 1, 2, 3, 4 levels exist in our countries, but in each classroom. And the teacher has to face those that are lagging 1 year behind or are not lagging behind. And so we need the competencies of the teacher. And as Claudia said, we need four solutions. Teachers need support. And as Gina said, to provide that support, we need information that we didn't have and which is necessary for educational systems, and implement comprehensive solutions, thinking first of all about the teacher and the student. There's a lot more to discuss, but a round of applause for this great panel that gives us a regional context and shows us how to be part of the solution. And now Alberto Arenas from ECLAC. Thank you very much, Carlos. Well, 3 hours again, 3 hours ago, we said good morning, and now we say good afternoon. It's been 3 very intensive hours with lots of information for the region. I would like to greet everyone that is still with us and to greet about 500 people that have followed us this morning and this afternoon online from over 12 countries of the region. Particularly, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, those who presented, those who analyzed the educational landscape of the region, and the authorities and experts that discussed the main challenges that faced by Latin America and the Caribbean, which are the learning crisis, how to decrease educational gaps, and how to take advantage of the lessons learned during the pandemic. PISA 2022, it's a first evaluation. It is standardized at a large scale, carried out post-pandemic, and brings a lot of information that will help us design public policies for education. I won't summarize the 3 hours. It's impossible. That's not my point, my purpose, but I will point out some figures that are that confirm what we know, which is the picture that the region has. It's a picture that comes from a movie. It's not just one moment. 3 out of 4 students in the region do not reach basic competencies in mathematics. And when 75% is compared with 31% in OECD countries, 1 out of 2, 55%, cannot understand a simple text, compared with 26% of the students in the OECD. Even more so, when you rank those 81 countries, the region appears not in the upper ranking, but really concentrates in the lower half. And in that sense, these PISA data are an evidence of the high inequalities of these learning results, where Latin America and the Caribbean is a very unequal region, not only income-wise, but as we said, from ECLAC, we have a matrix of social inequality that explain many times the results that we have discussed today. Well, PISA's results show us the differences in performance, socioeconomic level. They're very high in the region, not only for the students from low-income households do worse, but also inequality reflects other things explained by the matrix, explained by migration, by gender, by the territory, amongst others. And even though the region has made important progress, this is a reality in terms of access and graduation in the last decade. There are inclusion needs, and this is an obstacle to move forward towards an inclusive social development, which is a strategic dimension of sustainable development. The impacts of the pandemic deepened these challenges, and as pointed out last year, In the 2022 Social Economic Conference, the pandemic also generates an opportunity to transform educational systems in the region.
Educativos implementaron
The education systems applied key innovations that we can learn a great deal from and take lessons from. So let's take advantage of this impetus to rethink and redesign the education system so that we can work towards resilient and inclusive systems with an educational proposal that is quality. Now, we know that the situation is critical today with regard to inclusive social development. So given the low investments in education, we have also seen low growth, low productivity, high levels of poverty, and high levels of inequality in the region. We also have high levels of informal economy as well. Therefore, the current outlook, in addition to weak social protection systems in education and health, further weaken the region's social and economic potential. So the region truly needs to position education at the core of development strategies, at the heart of what we call sustainable development strategy. International evidence has confirmed that countries able to make a quantitative and qualitative leap in development have significantly invested in individuals' skills and capacities, recognizing that citizens are a country's main assets. For having a better future is essential, as we have discussed and will continue to discuss at the special meeting of ministers of education to be held here at ECLAC in 2024, it's not just urgent to recover and reform our education systems post-pandemic, but it's also important to ensure that we accompany this with actions that allow us to secure the financial stability and security of these systems. In other words, more sustainable investments so that we may roll out educational policies that are stable over time and that also do not rely on certain cycles. The region needs to invest more in education, but more efficient investments and more equitable investments. So it's more education, more resources, more efficiently, and hence better distributed. And these investments in education they are profitable. We know that. We know that they're profitable. We also know that these are intelligent, smart investments, particularly from as was when we think about individuals and the collective. And the opportunity cost of not doing this is much greater than the financial effort involved in making these investments. And in that regard, and even more importantly, when we're dealing with a period of many plethora of changes, climate change, digital change, etc. So we profoundly value and appreciate the effort of the OECD to involve the 14 countries from the region in PISA 2022. As we've already mentioned, this assessment will be very important for public policies, educational public policies in the region, and also important to ensure that girls, boys, and young people are better prepared and more to creatively address the various dimensions of education, and so that we may all together build a more prosperous future for the region. So thank you, Daniela. Thank you, Danielle. Thank you, Danielle, for coming across the continent, across the globe from Paris. Thank you to our dear Claudia from UNESCO, who has been joining us all morning long. And of course, thank you to the distinguished panelists who have joined us this morning as well at this launching. Likewise, today we're talking about education, but in a week's time, we will be doing the same with the ministers of education. Of course, this will address the importance of investing in education, but investments in education are important for investment per se, but also for our strategies throughout the region. Education is essential for addressing quality and inequality. Education is crucial for the social mobility required in our region. So with that, I would like to close and adjourn this meeting. Again, thank you for your participation. And by the way, we all have a QR code to fill out a survey. You have received this virtually. I kindly request that you fill out that survey. Thank you in advance and thank you very much.